There were some very good and very bad equipment designs to come out of World War II, and a soldier's experience could be greatly impacted by the gear that they had access to. Today, we're going to look at 5 items that were loved by US soldiers during the war due to their great designs. Some of these items are famous and iconic, and others you've probably never heard of, but today we'll be giving all of them the recognition they deserve. With that said, let's get to the first item. It's probably the most recognizable one on the list, and that is number 1, Paratrooper Boots. These jump boots have to be the most iconic piece of footwear in US military history. Having troops jump out of planes was a new concept at the start of World War II, and in addition to the new tactics and procedures that were being developed for airborne troops, the Army was also working on specialized equipment that would be suited to the unique needs of paratroopers. By the time the first paratroopers were deployed in combat, they wore different helmets, ammo pouches, uniforms, and boots than regular US Army troops. So why did paratroopers need specialized boots to get the job done? Well, these jump boots were essentially the same as the standard Type 2 service shoes worn by most US soldiers at the time, except they extended much higher, ending around the calf, as opposed to the service shoes which were only ankle height. This increased height offered much better ankle support, which was needed to protect a paratrooper's ankles during a rough parachute landing. Soldiers also appreciated that extra ankle support while marching or navigating rough terrain. These higher boots also eliminated the need for leggings. Leggings, also known as gaiters or spats, were canvas cuffs that were worn on top of the service shoes to keep debris from getting inside your shoes. The leggings were tightened using a series of hooks and laces, and there was likely some concern that these could become snagged on a paratrooper's rigging during a jump or cause some other issues. It was just another thing that could go wrong, and most soldiers weren't fond of leggings to begin with, so eliminating the need for leggings was definitely an added bonus of the jump boots. These were just all-around great boots, and paratroopers loved them. But they didn't just love them because of the functionality, they loved them because they were special. These soldiers were fighting in America's cutting-edge elite fighting force. They received special training, they were issued custom gear, and the Army was bragging about this new elite force all over the place to boost morale. These guys thought they were hot and honestly, they kinda were. Everyone else in the Army had to wear those stupid low boots and leggings, but not them, not the paratroopers. If they walked into a room wearing these boots, everyone immediately knew they were special, and they were damn proud of that. Because of the boots' great design and the unique identity they afforded paratroopers, troops were not too happy when these boots were replaced by the M1943 combat boot in 1944. Even though these boots were a bit quicker to get on and off due to the buckles on the side, most paratroopers considered them to be a downgrade from their jump boots. These new boots didn't offer the same ankle support as the jump boots, they weren't as waterproof, they didn't insulate the feet as well in cold weather, but worst of all, they were giving them to regular infantrymen. How were these special paratroopers supposed to have pride in their boots when any average Joe in the Army could wear them? One supply sergeant in the 82nd Airborne Division wrote this about these new boots. "The combat boots are too cold and do not give us any support around our ankles like our jump boots do." Many troops held on to their old jump boots and either continued to wear them instead of the new combat boots, or kept them in reserve so that they wouldn't wear out in battle and they could continue wearing them with their dress uniforms. The tradition of US paratroopers wearing jump boots with their dress uniforms still continues in certain airborne divisions to this day, and Corcoran, the main company that produced these boots during World War II, still makes a boot that's very similar to the World War II jump boots. Despite the fact that these boots were designed for the airborne, there was a demand for these boots among regular ground troops as well. The idea of having some extra ankle support and not having to wear leggings over your boots was very appealing, and some US soldiers in Italy started taking their service shoes to local cobblers who added material to the top to make them similar to jump boots. These modified boots are often called MTO boots by collectors today, MTO standing for Mediterranean Theater of Operations. I'm sure the paratroopers would have loved to be the only special soldiers to get to wear these boots, but that didn't last for long. The jump boots ended up being used for a number of other purposes during the war, and other troops were keen to get their hands on a pair of these, not just because of their functionality, but because of their status. Certain troops in the Navy Beach Battalions, Navy Combat Demolitions Units, Engineer Special Brigades, and Army Rangers were issued jump boots leading up to D-Day to aid with their specialized roles. The boots also became available for officers to purchase for themselves, and they were flying off the shelves. The officer in charge of the 582nd Quartermaster Quartermaster Sales Company store is quoted as saying, "The demand for paratroop boots is strong and is increasing because frontline officers have observed a few new pairs worn by officers in rear installations." A Quartermaster report also noted that in the First Army, quote, "most officers either have the combat boot or the paratroop boot." These boots weren't just for the boys either. Female nurses seemed especially fond of the Paratrooper boots, probably because their alternative footwear option kinda sucked. A Quartermaster report had this to say regarding the 97th Field Hospital nurses. A general desire for paratroop or combat boots was expressed. The present field shoe was reported as being not adequate for field use because it did not keep out water. A different section of the report stated, "A sales store reported that between 400 and 500 pairs of paratroop boots were sold to the nurses in the past 30 days. The sales store also reported nurses are not buying field shoes." Paratrooper boots were also issued in some other pretty unique circumstances. An article from the 90th Infantry Division Preservation Group reports that in 1942, the Army declared certain individuals as lacking the mental acuity and motor skills to use leggings. I mean, these can be a little tricky to figure out at first, but come on. Those soldiers had to be issued substitute footwear since they couldn't figure out how to use the leggings. That meant that for some, wearing paratrooper boots really did mean you were special, just not in the way the paratroopers had in mind. Even though the jump boots ended up being used pretty heavily outside of airborne divisions, I would not want to be an infantryman wearing jump boots walking into a bar filled with paratroopers in 1944. Just because the Army let other soldiers wear jump boots does not mean the paratroopers were okay with it. These boots were an extremely well-designed piece of equipment that were given a larger-than-life status by the soldiers who wore them. Not only are they an iconic piece of military history, they influenced countless other military boot designs, some of which are still in use on battlefields today. After all, you don't see many modern soldiers running around in canvas leggings, do you? This next item was appreciated for very different reasons, but soldiers seem to love it just as much, and that is number 2, the GI pocket stove. The stove, cooking, gasoline, one burner, better known as the GI pocket stove or sometimes the M1941 stove, was a small gasoline-powered stove used by soldiers in World War II. And man, that thing was a luxury on the front lines. It would be hard for me to understate the importance of a hot meal to soldiers who were living on the line. When soldiers weren't on the front lines, they often ate hot meals cooked by field kitchens, but it wasn't possible to set up those big field kitchens on the front. When possible, meals were prepared in kitchens behind the lines and then brought forward to troops in insulated mermite containers, but more often than not, soldiers had to rely on rations for sustenance in combat. This little stove made the difference between choking down your rations cold or enjoying them as a hot meal. The stove also allowed soldiers to cook in small groups on the front. The stove's container doubled as a cooking pot, and it was common to see troops combining bits from everyone's rations along with locally sourced ingredients to cook a meal for their squad. I would eat a meal like that over a cold sea ration any day, and for troops living on the line for extended periods of time, meals like that were an incredible morale booster. The role of the stove wasn't just limited to cooking either. Here's what a Quartermaster report had to say about the stove's use within the 3rd Armored Division. This stove is not only used for cooking purposes, but probably more often for other reasons, such as heating water for shaving, washing clothing, taking sponge baths, and providing heat in small tents and hastily constructed structures for drying wet clothing. When soldiers were living outside in the winter, there weren't many things that couldn't be improved by the warm flame of a pocket stove. Many other utility items like this were often left in the rear when soldiers moved out to the front lines, but not these stoves. Soldiers loved them way too much to leave them behind. Another Quartermaster report noted, "The stove can be used in practically all situations by the combat troops for heating rations and is exceedingly popular. One-burner stoves are rarely discarded by the troops when going to the line. They are either taken into combat or left on the motor vehicles." Like that report mentioned, it seems it was common in certain units to store the stoves on vehicles, then wait for a lull in the action to go access the stoves and cook their meals. Even though these stoves were pretty light and portable, soldiers traveled very light, so it's understandable that a lot of guys didn't want to be the one getting stuck carrying this stove in a firefight. Although some soldiers in the 29th Infantry seemed to disagree with that. Here's what a quartermaster report said about the stove's use within the 29th. They were well liked. The utility cups are used for cooking, and while some simple carrier strap would be desirable, the demand for the stoves is so great that most of the soldiers said, "Go get us the stoves and we'll carry them." It's easy to understand why soldiers loved having a heat source like this on the front lines, but don't be misled into thinking that soldiers would have loved just any old heat source as much as they loved this stove. These stoves in particular were loved because of their great design. They were designed by Coleman, a company that knew a thing or two about camping stoves, and that particular design was called the Coleman 520. The stoves were extremely reliable, durable, and compact. They had fold-out feet and pot holders to keep them sturdy during use, and they could run on regular old gasoline, which was usually pretty easy for troops to come by. I already mentioned that the metal case could double as a cooking pot, but I'm saying it again because it's such a good idea. During the war, the quartermasters looked into replacing these stoves with ration heating tablets, and soldiers were not happy about that. The stove was just better and more effective than any ration heating tablet could be. Even the German heating tablets, which many US troops considered to be superior to the American ones. After the war, Coleman sold a nearly identical camping stove called the Model 530 on the civilian market. They even advertised that stove as the GI pocket stove due to the great reputation the stove developed with soldiers during the war. The biggest issue that soldiers seemed to have with the stove was just that they couldn't get enough of them. Here's another excerpt from a quartermaster report that touches on that. Armored units suggest a revision of the table of organization and equipment to provide more stoves for their units. Currently, they are provided one stove per vehicle, and this has been inadequate. The experience of the 4th and 6th Armored Divisions has been that in combat, they must eat by tank crews and half-track groups, and are unable to utilize their kitchens. Consequently, there is a definite need for a readjustment of the allotments of the stove, cooking, gasoline, one burner. The quartermaster reports I referenced say so many good things about these stoves that I can't even fit them all in this section, but here are some random quotes from the reports that highlight just how popular they were. The one burner gasoline stove is a very popular item among combat troops because of its compactness and ease of operation. This is a very popular item and is used extensively. Infantrymen want these stoves. This item is used extensively and is very well liked. The one burner stove is one of the best items the Quartermaster Corps issues us. This stove was such an important item for troops on the front lines, and I still don't think it gets the recognition it deserves. So I was very excited to see when it made a cameo on the big screen in Band of Brothers. Look at the little guy go, he's a natural on camera. This next item has certainly had no shortage of features on the big screen, and that is number 3, the M42 Paratrooper Uniform. Hey, what do you know? Another airborne item made the list. Paratroopers loved their specialized gear, and the M1942 Paratrooper jumpsuit was certainly held in high regard by the troops who wore it. Similar to the jump boots we covered, this uniform was custom made to meet the unique needs of paratroopers. It featured large cargo pockets with snap closures on the jacket and pants to hold all the little things paratroopers needed to carry, an attached waist belt to snug up the jacket close to your body. Early versions of the pants had triangular wool panels on the leg to make them easier to tuck into the jump boots. There was extra material pleated on the back of the jacket to avoid restricting a paratrooper's movement. And most unique of all, the jacket had a small pocket near the collar with zippers on both sides. This pocket held the M2 switchblade knife. The idea was, if a soldier needed to cut their parachute risers, they would have a knife easily accessible that wasn't covered up by their harness. The dual zipper meant they could access it from either side in case one of their arms was broken or tangled in their rigging, and since the knife was a switchblade, they only needed one hand to operate it. Pretty smart if you ask me. Now, if you learned anything during the jump boots section, I probably don't need to tell you that functionality wasn't the only reason why paratroopers loved this uniform. It was stylish, it was instantly identifiable, and it gave the paratroopers a unique identity. Even enemy soldiers recognized paratroopers by their baggy uniforms, and apparently they were given nicknames by German soldiers such as devils in baggy pants or butchers with big pockets. Nicknames that the paratroopers accepted with pride. During the war, this uniform was replaced by the M1943 uniform. This was probably an overall upgrade. The M43 was made of a thicker, more durable material. It was a darker color that was less visible to the enemy, and it had a few other slight improvements. But it just didn't have have the same cool factor as the M1942 uniform. Even after the new M43 uniforms were adopted, many troops held on to their old M42 uniforms, and you can see them in use throughout the end of the war. It seems that even though the M42 uniform had been officially phased out by the end of the war, that was still the uniform that most paratroopers identified with. When you see World War II airborne veterans wearing a uniform, they're typically rocking that classic M42 jump jacket that became part of their identity during the war, even though many of them probably made just as much use of the M43 uniform. It just goes to show how much those troops loved this iconic piece of airborne history. Even though this uniform was loved by soldiers during the war, it did have some flaws that I think are worth covering, and that shouldn't be surprising given that we've already covered the fact that it was replaced during the war. The biggest flaw of the M42 uniform was its twill material. Even though the material made for a comfortable and lightweight uniform, it just didn't hold up to the abuse that paratroopers put it through. They were known to tear at the elbows and knees, and the pockets would sometimes fail during jumps when they were stuffed full of equipment. To solve those issues, parachute riggers modified the uniforms by reinforcing them with thick canvas. They added this material to the elbows and knees. They reinforced the pockets to prevent them from tearing open, and they also added ties to the pants so soldiers could tie down their cargo pockets and keep them from swinging around while they were on the move. Some paratroopers had additional modifications done to their uniforms, like the addition of extra pockets. These reinforced M42 uniforms were the best version of the uniform in terms of functionality, and this is the version that troops famously wore on D-Day. I think the biggest thing to come out of the M42 uniform was the recognition of a need for more pocket space. The designers of the uniform were correct in thinking that paratroopers needed large pockets to carry equipment on their person, but regular infantry troops lived out of their pockets as well, and they wanted more pocket space too. A quartermaster from the 80th Infantry Division made note of this when describing his idea for the ideal combat uniform. I suggest a one-piece combat uniform for all troops with these features: a zippered front, pockets of the paratroop type, and both waterproof and windproof. These large pockets ended up being incorporated in the M43 jacket as well, which was issued to paratroopers and regular infantry troops alike. That was a big upgrade for regular infantry troops who were used to using the M41 jacket, which only had two small pockets with no closures. It wasn't just the size of the M42 pockets that was innovative either. The way the pockets were arranged made them easy to access, and similar pocket layouts were used on later US military uniforms, like these Vietnam-era jungle fatigues. Even modern US Army uniform jackets feature slanted breast pockets similar to the M42 uniform. This next item definitely isn't as recognizable or iconic as the M42 jump uniform. In fact, there's a good chance you've never even heard of them, but boy, were soldiers happy to have them. Next up is number 4, shoe packs and overshoes. These are two different items, but it makes sense to group them together because they accomplish the same thing and soldiers love them for many of the same reasons. These are two types of boots meant to keep soldiers' feet warm and dry in winter conditions. Let's start by talking about overshoes, since those were much more common than shoe packs for most of the war. Overshoes are what they sound like. They're boots that go on over your shoes, and you'll often hear them referred to as Arctics or galoshes. You could pull these on top of your service shoes, jump boots, combat boots, whatever type of footwear you were issued. Having cold, wet feet in the field wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous, and it caused many soldiers during the war to develop frostbite or trench foot. The standard leather boots just weren't enough to protect soldiers' feet from the elements. After all, you can only put on so many pairs of socks inside your boots to try to keep your feet warm. The overshoes warmed your feet, they kept out snow and mud, and they just acted as an additional layer between your foot and the cold ground. There were two different types of overshoes used in cold weather. One was made of rubber, and one had an upper that was made of a felt-like material. Both types used a series of buckles to cinch down on top of a soldier's boots. It seems that in general, the rubber type was preferred over the cloth type, but the cloth ones were more common. A quartermaster report noted this about the 10th Infantry Division. This regiment used the 5-buckle rubber overshoes in Iceland for 2 years and preferred it to the cloth type. Another section of that report about the 318th Infantry Regiment says, "We received the rubber and cloth types. The men prefer the rubber overshoes because it's warmer, more waterproof, and easier to clean. The rubber type is also less tiring because it picks up less mud and absorbs no water." Some other troops noted that the cloth type wasn't quite as durable and that the buckles on their leggings would wear holes in them and the soles would crack over time. The rubber type was probably a bit less breathable than the cloth ones, but for something that's meant to keep water out, I think rubber was the better choice. Soldiers really loved having these overshoes on hand, and in general, they performed very well. With that said, strapping another pair of boots on top of your boots could be a bit clunky and awkward for some, and it became common practice in certain units to remove the overshoes before an attack so soldiers could maintain mobility. An officer in the 5th Infantry Division said this about the overshoes. Performance to date has been very satisfactory. The commanding officers of several infantry rifle companies have their men remove overshoes before an attack for mobility and security of the individual. Other troops wear them at all times for protection against cold and wet conditions. Thankfully, the overshoes could be removed very quickly, and soldiers already had other boots on underneath them, so they could just pop them off and move out. The biggest issue that soldiers seemed to encounter with the overshoes wasn't with the design of the shoes themselves, it was trying to get them in the proper sizes that they needed. It's reported that many groups didn't receive enough large size overshoes, and that the different variations and manufacturers used inconsistent sizing. This made it tough for some troops to get overshoes in the sizes they needed, and some troops had to wear the overshoes with no boots underneath if they couldn't get a pair big enough to fit over their boots. Those troops often ended up just putting on a bunch of pairs of thick socks, then buckling the overshoes on top to keep their feet dry. The overshoes were in very high demand because they served such an important purpose for troops on the front line. I think this quote from an officer in the 30th Infantry Division helps demonstrate how effective overshoes were at protecting soldiers' feet. Every man with trench foot in this regiment is questioned by the executive officer in an effort to ascertain the cause. Invariably, these individuals did not have overshoes. In the later days of the war, troops in certain divisions were issued a different type of waterproof boot: shoe packs. Unlike the overshoes, these were standalone boots that were worn on their own. They were made from leather and rubber, and their construction is very similar to the modern duck boots sold by LL Bean and other similar companies. These had some pros and cons compared to overshoes, but overall, I think they were a better method of keeping your feet dry. Since they weren't worn on top of other boots, they were a bit easier to move around in, and they did a great job of keeping water from penetrating the boots and keeping soldiers' feet warm. A quartermaster report stated, "About 75% of the troops in the 7th Army are equipped with shoe packs. Nearly all of the infantry are so equipped. Most men would rather have the shoe pack than any other item for cold, wet weather." That's some high praise right there, but I think this quote from an officer in the 1st Infantry Division really highlights the impact of the shoe packs. The effects of the issue of shoe packs has already been felt. In the 3-day period before their issue, we had 120 cases of frostbitten feet in the division. In the 2 days we have had shoe packs on the infantrymen, we have only had 4 cases of frostbite. The shoe pack was just a great wintertime boot, and similar versions saw extensive use in the bitter cold of the Korean War. They weren't perfect though, and there were some cons to the shoe packs as well. They weren't very breathable, and some soldiers complained that their feet got very sweaty and uncomfortable on the move. Other troops complained about getting blisters from marching in the boots, and some said they didn't have sufficient arch support, but I think these small issues are well worth having warm, dry feet, and most soldiers seem to agree. Now, this next item is definitely one that'll look familiar if you've ever served in the US military, and that is number 5, the TL122 Flashlight. Nowadays, it would seem crazy to send a soldier off to the front lines without a flashlight in their kit, but during World War II, flashlights were not standard issue for most troops. There was typically a set number of flashlights allocated to each company for soldiers with specific roles, and if you weren't one of the ones to get a flashlight, you either had to share or try to get one on your own. If you were one of the lucky ones to get a flashlight though, you were treated to the best flashlight the US military had to offer, the famous TL122. This was the first flashlight issued by the US Army that fits our modern definition of what a flashlight should be. These were Anglehead flashlights that produce a pretty narrow beam of light and were small enough to slide right into a soldier's pocket. There were a few different versions of this design used during the war, the first of which was the TL122A, which was made of brass. The plastic TL122B was next to land in the hands of US soldiers, and the C followed, which was pretty much the same thing, just made with better materials. The TL122D came around later in the war, and it's really not clear how much use those saw before the war wrapped up. The D model had a new base plate that could store colored lens filters for the light, and a new lens cap that could hold the filters in front of the bulb. They also introduced adapters to retrofit these older model flashlights with those colored lens filters, but those came around late enough in the war that I don't think colored lenses were a super common sight until after World War II. The TL122s featured a clip so you could clip them to your gear and use them hands-free. They had easily replaceable batteries and bulbs with an extra bulb stored in the base plate of the flashlight, and they had a 3-position on-off switch. The light could be turned on and off normally, but it also had this middle position that allowed the light to be controlled using this small button so soldiers could communicate using Morse code. We take it for granted nowadays, but having a reliable light source that could be flicked on with a switch and was small enough to fit inside your pocket was huge for that time. And as you can imagine, soldiers were keen to get their hands on these. I don't think I need to spend a ton of time covering why these were helpful to soldiers, because I think we all understand that having a light is pretty useful when it's dark out. The design was refined with each new iteration, and even though some of the earlier models had slight drawbacks, like the TL122, which reportedly gave off a bad odor sometimes due to the plastic it was made from, it was clear that the Anglehead flashlight concept was here to stay. In the 1960s, the Army switched over to the MX99/U flashlight. That was very similar to the TL122D with just some slight improvements. Even today, the US military uses flashlights that have the same basic design as the TL122 flashlights used in World War II. There really aren't many designs that have stood the test of time like these Anglehead flashlights have, and their impressive length of service is a testament to their great design. I don't really know how soldiers today feel about these flashlights. I'd guess they're kind of becoming a bit outdated, but back in World War II, this was cutting edge. It's crazy to think that some troops today are basically still making use of the same flashlights that paratroopers used to navigate the Normandy countryside on D-Day over 80 years ago. Everyone loves to talk about how great the World War II German designs were, but how many troops today are walking around with those weird-ass German flashlights from the war, huh? That's what I thought. Well guys, that's all 5 items. If you haven't seen the other videos I've made about gear that soldiers loved and hated during World War II, head over to my page and check those out. If you like these videos and you learned something, please consider supporting my work on Patreon using the link in the description, and I'll see you all in the next one.